I'm also nervous because I'm representing civil society where this is about big word trust. And how can we as civil society and the bank and IMF work together in a constructive engagement and where we can collaborate and make this world better. I also wanted to say two principles. One is every voice counts around the globe. So people and friends from around the globe are tweeting, sending questions, comments, even venting their anger. We accept that. And I hope the questions sent through tweets and also emails can be addressed by the two institutions. The other things I want to say also, this town hall, I want to thank you, the IMF and the bank, for giving space to civil society and how we can interact constructively, but also how we can ask for the two institutions more accountable, more transparent, more responsive, and more addressing the issues that the CSO is working or concerns. I want to make it short. One, if you have a question and answer, there'll be a question and answer. Please address your question with respect of others. We only have 60 minutes of time, and we have already looked at all the issues that is coming from the tweets around the globe, excitingly. There's 310 tweets. There is also tweets about the IMF and the World Bank meeting, and I wanted to read a couple of issues. One is, these are the 17 issues that came out of the 100,000 tweets related to IMF World Bank meeting. Technology, inequality, environmental justice, climate justice, jobs, world beyond banks, infrastructure, sustainability, corporate greedy, risk financing, young people or the youth, human rights, corruption, inclusive development, debt for development, urban and city for all, renewable energy, and rainforest. So these are the issues that is coming in as 100,000 tweets related to the IMF and the World Bank meeting. Now, I would give the first question maybe to Christine, and then to Jim. Yep. I will start the question, and then the floor, please ask your question. Over the last weeks, you delivered some important remarks, including at the UN, on how the IMF is contributing to the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals. This may come as an interest to us and as news to many of us in the room. Could you give us an overview? What role can the fund play in achieving in SDGs?
Sure. Thank you, Monica, for that question, and good afternoon to all of you. And it's very nice to be here. I was telling Monica that it's a bit strange to be sitting on that big podium and to have you there. It's not very nice, I have to say. I would much prefer to be standing with you. No, not standing or dancing, but yeah, together. Anyway, 2 words about the genesis of that project, which is only beginning. At the request of Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and with strong encouragement as well from Jeff Sachs, who has worked on that and who continues to work on that, we have tried to use the resources that we have to identify the financing that will be needed in order for all countries to reach the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Because while it's really important to have agreed on the 17 principles, it's also critically important to understand where the financing will come from, and where it comes from will largely be determined by how much it is. So we have done pilot studies on 5 countries, and we have extrapolated from those 5 pilots to all the low-income countries, as we define them, to try to measure how much will be needed and therefore where it will have to come from. And of the 49 low-income countries under our definition, and excluding those that will be able to reach the goals all by themselves, we've identified that $520 billion will be needed annually by 2030 for the key basic principles of electricity, water, health, and basic infrastructure in order to reach as many as possible as the 17 principles. So $520 billion per year by 2030, it's a phenomenally large amount of money for those countries. At the same time, it's only 0.5% of global GDP. So the next question is, where will the money come from? And how can the IMF help? Part of the money will have to be generated locally, and that's, pursuant to the Addis Ababa financing for development principle, that there has to be domestic revenue mobilization. There we can help. We can provide technical assistance, we can guide, we can help design a good tax and fiscal system in order to identify and collect some of that financing. But it will never be enough. It's too much. So financing will have to come also from donors' countries, and clearly grants are better than loans, and if it is loans, it has to be concessional rather than at market rates. And third, the private sector will have to be involved, as well as philanthropists, and all sources will be needed. So where we can help is, number one, by putting a number out there to say, we cannot leave those 49 low-income countries on their own, assuming that they will do it by themselves. Outside help will be needed. Second, we can help by providing the technical assistance to those countries for that portion that they can achieve by themselves, which is the domestic revenue mobilization. Now, I don't know whether I can hand the floor over to Jim, but in many ways, through some of his financing, he can induce the private sector, he can induce or partner with philanthropists or others in order to also bridge that gap of the $520 billion.
Okay, thank you. Maybe a question to Jim. Jim, we've heard about the Human Capital Project. Can you say more about this and the overall priorities, and what are the role of the CSO and the Human Capital Project? And how would you bring this around all the CSOs as partner in your Human Capital Project?
Well, Monica, thank you, and thanks everybody for coming. I have to say, we're used to sitting at a table looking you all in the eye, and so I'm really, it's we're not looking down. We're with you. So, first, just a word on what Christine said. So, I think this is just so valuable, and I have to tell you, this is just it's a great tribute to Christine Lagarde, because she brought the SDGs, inequality, climate change, gender equality right into the IMF, and I can tell you that those were not priorities in the past. And so having the IMF helping to define what the needs are is really important. Now, I think, $520 billion for 49 poorest countries, and so if you add then middle-income countries, the overall tab for reaching the SDGs is going to be very high. But exactly like she said, I want you to know that we're completely together and also with the UN in thinking about how do we actually meet those needs. My own view, and this is directly related to the Human Capital Project. When I first saw the SDGs, I thought, oh my God, there's so many targets, 169, so many things. And then when I travel around the world and I see how rapidly people are getting access to broadband and smartphones, I've come to the conclusion that all of those things are pretty much what everyone's going to want, because everyone is going to be able to see how everyone else lives. And so how you get there is critical. And I would just stress, we have to use all the different mechanisms, including ensuring that for the poorest countries and the poorest people, that they get direct support. We can't expect the poorest to be able to receive a loan from a private bank. That's not going to happen. And so we have to divide up, but there's going to be so many needs that we're going to have to use every single source available, including the work we're doing together on improving tax collection. Many of the poorest people that you advocate for, they pay their taxes, and it's often the elite of the developing countries who don't pay their taxes, and so we have to work on that. Now, in light of the things that are changing so quickly, in light of technology that's changing the nature of jobs, and also in light of the extraordinary aspirations that are popping up that everyone seems to be embracing, we took a hard look at what was happening, especially in global health and global education. Some of you may know that I've been working in those areas for most of my adult life. And 25, 30 years ago, there was almost no money for global health or global education, maybe a couple $100 million a year for all the global health activities, and most of them were eradication or elimination efforts around specific diseases. And then we beat the drum and we really put pressure on donors, and then we saw a rapid increase in the amount of money for things like HIV, TB, malaria. All those things were great, and we saw some great victories. But what we realized at the $20, $30 billion that we've been able to generate from donors is not nearly enough to meet the demands of all the people in the world. And so we felt like we needed to first make very clear the connection between improving health and education outcomes and economic growth. Now, I meet with ministers of finance all the time, and so whether or not something contributes to economic growth is important. But it's especially important for human capital and investment in the health and education of people, especially poor people, because the results that you see in terms of economic growth usually don't happen right away. It takes years, sometimes decades, for investments in a newborn child's health and well-being to be felt at the level of a growing economy. So because of that, we felt like we needed to bring the reality of health and education investment and its connection to economic growth right in front of everyone's eyes. Unfortunately, I think in many, many countries, what we've seen is that going from 200 million a year to 20 billion a year, it began to seem like the only real game in town was whether we could get donors to give more. And I have to tell you that some heads of state and government and some ministers of finance got into that story as well and kept saying, well, gee, we'd spend more on health and education if the donors just gave us more. And after 25, 30 years of doing this work, I came to the conclusion that that just will not work anymore, that we have to change the incentives. We have to incentivize leaders of countries to take responsibility for the health and education outcomes of their own people. And so we're doing a ranking because the ranking is what actually draws the attention of journalists, certainly, of opposition parties, certainly, but we hope also heads of state, heads of government, and especially ministers of finance. And so I especially want to ask of all of you, look at the Human Capital Index and then use that to ask questions of the leaders in your countries. Why are we here on the Human Capital Index? Why aren't we higher? What are you doing to improve outcomes in health and education so that we can go up the index? Now, for many, like for example, ratings agencies, they've told us that they're going to take a hard look at these rankings to see if they misunderstood something about the potential growth of a particular country, because we're revealing aspects of their human capital flow, the human capital that's going to be entering the market soon, that they may not have thought of before. So this is, after 30 years of working in this field, I've come to the conclusion that increased donor support alone will never get us to the point where all children have a chance. I mean, 25% of all children in the world are stunted, 2 standard deviations below height for age. Those children, and we've done study after study, those children will have a very hard time being competitive in an increasingly digital economy. And so I'm presenting this to leaders as an emergency. This is literally an emergency. As a medical doctor, I can tell you, this is like a medical emergency. We have to move much more quickly with much more resources. And if, as Christine was saying, if they improve domestic resource mobilization, if they get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, if they get rid of often ill-targeted agriculture subsidies, if they put on tobacco taxes, if they bring in more private sector financing for infrastructure, there will be more resources. And so our goal is to create a movement that will push us along much more quickly to reach that point when we can say every child that's born today will have a chance to reach their highest aspirations because they won't be stunted, they will be stimulated, they'll have nutrition, and they'll go into a good school where they'll learn every year that they're there.
Thank you, Jim.
Can I just add one thing? Very super quickly, it's in follow-up to...
I also have to be disciplined
I'll be
speaker.
15 seconds.
Okay.
Because of my $520 billion.
Okay.
Because I just want to clarify one thing. You will see lots of other numbers. And when we were at the UN a couple of weeks ago, there were numbers floating around. And there's a bit of a race to the top where people want to come out with, you know, $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there. You have to pay real attention to exactly what is accounted for, what countries are concerned, before you jump to the conclusion that there is inconsistency there, it's more than that. The study has to be really methodical and based on actual facts and assessment.
Thank you. Again, this event is streaming live on the World Bank and IMF Live in English and Bahasa. You can follow it on Twitter, hashtag AMCSO18. I'll be taking questions from all of you. I think 2 from here and 2 from here. Please mention your name and your organization, and keep it short. I want to make it.
I think you can line up behind the microphones, probably.
Please keep it short.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, President Kim and Madam Lagarde and all friends here. Actually, my name is Aha Maftuhan. I'm from Prakarsa, based in Jakarta, Indonesia.
Actually, we can't understand.
I think the
either can't hear or there's an echo or something.
Echo. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Maybe you speak very slowly, because...
Okay.
I think there's an echo in the sound system. Yeah. Please reduce the echo.
My name is Aha Maftuhan. I'm from Prakarsa, NGO-based think tank in Indonesia. Actually, I'm just read the communique of People Summit on Alternative Development. Voices on equality and justice from the past to the future. President Kim and Madam Lagarde, a number of CSO in Indonesia and international CSO already agreed that to respond in the IMF and World Bank meeting here, we have initiative to use the forum to push some issue that related to our concern. One is how to the fund and the bank and member countries to establish more strengthened on accountability mechanism for its performance, which inclusive, material, responsive, and accountable for the impact. So this is including for projects that have been complete in the past, not only a current project. The second is all countries members need to ensure that every project financed by World Bank and IMF, the main beneficiaries are the community. So not only investor, not only big player, but also a community at the field level. Member countries should to carry out projects audit or policies on debt to find out which debt is effective and not and seek negotiation of payment for effective debt, including the possibility of debt write-off. And then the bank and the fund and the all member countries need to remove impunity from all project implementers financed by the bank and the fund. And then the last is how to stop using one size fit for all approach in design policy, as it is, has been proved to be ineffective, even dangerous. Thank you, and I will submit directly to President Kim and Madame Lagarde of the communique.
Oh, good.
Thank you. I would go for the next question. Please make it short. Have respect for other civil society members who has their... Thank you, Maftu.
Hello. My name is Arun. I'm coming from Cambodia, represent the Cooperation Committee for Cambodia, and also representing for Asia Development Alliance, as well as the Asian Democracy Network. By listening to the presenters, I have two questions. One, by understanding the financing for development as well as the SDGs, I think financing for development can be easily generated where everyone may have the resources. But the question is that how the enabling environment where the other stakeholders can be together, especially we would call for ADB, for World Bank and IMF focusing on how the SDG 16 and SDG 17 can be the foundation to achieve the other SDG goals. The second question is more to the World Bank, is on the human capital developments. What I would like to see, how you're gonna to clone yourself for the next 15 years as the world leaders. You know, I'm very concerned about the young generation who have not equipped well for the replacing yourself in the future. How you gonna to invest resources for the new leaders in the future? Thank you.
Next. Maybe on this, this row.
Thank you. Red Constantino with the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. My question is for the IMF. Madame Lagarde, your position on climate action, ambitious climate action, is well known and well applauded. The Philippines is facing at least $21 billion in stranding coal plant assets. That's a third of the national budget of the country. In Indonesia, about 133 trillion rupiah is projected to be spent in subsidies to support thermal coal sector expansion up to 2021. Vietnam probably has the similar figures. The question is, will the IMF look into the impacts on the region's macroeconomic stability with respect to stranding coal power? And do you think that central banks in Southeast Asia can afford to downplay risks associated with the energy transition and stranding coal power? Thank you.
My name is Kurniawan Sabar. I come from Institute for National and Democracy Studies and also the National Organizing Committee for People's Global Conference. First of all, allow us to thank the IMF World Bank for organizing this space for CSOs. But since not everybody have the capacity to be here today, outside this annual meeting, CSOs from all over the world will hold the People's Global Conference in Denpasar. It is collectively organized to enable CSOs and people's movement to freely air their concern on the impacts of IMF World Bank supported projects. However, the PGC is continuously being threatened. After a Bali-wide ban on public events, and there was an attempt to curb the holding of the People's Conference, state authorities resort to various forms of terrorist tagging through posters in public places, text message threatening to stop the PGC are being circulated. Steps are done to curtail freedom of assembly. Just this afternoon, the venue owner, the auditorium of RRI, canceled the reservation of the PGC. The National Police is also unreasonably asking for passport copies of the international delegates, despite lack of any legal basis for such requirements. Many participating CSOs are accredited participants to this official annual meeting planning to join the PGC. This is unjust. In this light, we call on the IMF and the World Bank to exercise its policies on inclusion, investing in human capital and public sector capacity. Thus, our questions: can we depend on the IMF, World Bank, to support parallel activities such as the People's Global Conference? Thank you. Together, let's defend people's democratic rights.
I'll take these two, and two from that side. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marie. I'm the Asia Advocacy and Marketing Manager from ACE Healthcare Foundation. So while we are talking about financing and also human capital projects, we want to highlight the fact that funding for middle-income country is shrinking because of these classifications. And many organizations, especially those working for people living with HIV/AIDS, they are losing the funding. And sometimes these countries, when they reach middle-income country status, they will lose the support from the global funder. And most of the time, these countries are relying on solely on one big donor who will donate their money according to their country status. So we think we have seen many of these organizations have shut down, and the life-saving organizations and projects have stopped. And we think these have to stop. And we are asking the IMF and World Bank to raise the MIC and to add additional efforts to help them. Thank you.
One more, and then we'll be.
Thank you. My name is Midnight. I work for an organization called APCOM based in Bangkok, Thailand. We are a network working on HIV issues and also those that affects the rights of LGBTI people in Asia Pacific. First of all, thank you for your leadership, President Jim Kim, for the appointment of the SOGI advisor. And in our region, we have seen there's a lot more evidence and also engagement of the World Bank with civil society working on LGBTI issues.
Yes.
And my question is about knowing that as citizens of a country and being included within economic development, and your discussions within the governments within our region, 17 still criminalizes homosexuality. Why is it difficult to engage governments on inclusion of LGBTI people? And secondly, what can a civil society network like APCOM do to help the inclusion discussion with our government? Thank you.
Okay. 6 questions taken. I give the floor to Madame Lagarde to answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The first question, I think, is included in the document that you've handed over to us, so we're going to read it carefully and respond to you as we promised to respond to all the questions, including those that would be coming from people who are not sitting in this room for reasons that I will touch on in a second. But the second question that you asked related to the financing for development. and in particular, I think, a question relating to Principle 17. And Principle 17 is clearly requiring cooperation, partnership, an approach that is collective. And, you know, while we are not the panacea, but certainly multilateral institutions such as the IMF, such as the bank, such as others, I'm sure, can be a forum where civil society organizations, where member states, and where private sector can actually get together. So, you know, whether it's in relation to trade, to development, to international taxation, to fintech, we strongly encourage those forums. We work together on some of those issues. We do research together, and we certainly would be happy to continue doing so. That was, I think, the first one. On climate, thank you for the question. Clearly, we have taken a very firm, principled position in relation to subsidies, where we believe that using public funding to subsidize the burning of fossil fuel of any sort is actually the wrong use of public finance. And we strongly encourage, as properly communicated, as smoothly implemented, because we don't want to cause very severe disruption for countries, but we strongly recommend in our policy advice, as we do in our programs when we have programs, that these subsidies be actually removed, and that instead of those, targeted programs be put in place that would be based on clean energy in the main, or targeted social programs in order to support people. Now, this principle applies in particular to subsidies that are given to people in relation to oil or gas, for instance, but certainly subsidies that deal with encouraging coal is of the same caliber and is just as fossil as oil and gas. Okay. The question that was asked about inclusion. We do support inclusion. We do believe that all voices matter, and we will address all the questions that have been asked, are asked, and will be asked. I know that more than 1,000 CSOs actually participate in these events. I know that more than 50 specific meetings have been organized with our teams, and we tried, in particular our Secretary General, tried to advocate that the matter that you have signaled be actually addressed and resolved positively so that all voices be heard, so that expressions can be made by those who want to make it. Now, I understand that this has not worked as you expected. We're going to take it back to the wonderful authorities of Indonesia, who are organizing extraordinary meeting space, hospitality, and a very generous welcome, that they try to do that for all, and that it be made available to all those who want to actually raise their voice and make their point. So we will go back to the authorities to again make the same point that we had made 2 days ago. We were under the impression that the matter had been resolved, but clearly it has not. So we'll push it again.
Jim, you want to answer some of the question?
Sure, and I just want to support the People's Global Conference. Our team has contacted the Indonesian authorities just today at the highest level, and so we strongly believe that this meeting should go forward, and we'll continue to do that along with the IMF. One of the questions was, how are we going to invest in the young generation? How to invest in the leaders of the future? This is what the Human Capital Index is all about. So in this country, 33% of children under 5 are stunted. A third of the children under 5 are stunted. And we have evidence actually from Indonesia that the children who were stunted in the 1990s today have not learned anywhere nearly as well as the non-stunted children, and their earnings are far lower. So we have clear evidence that this is a major issue. Now, the good news here in Indonesia is the Indonesians have committed to a transformational program to reduce stunting, and we plan to work with them. But that's the first step. If children are stunted, if children are not nourished and stimulated in the first 1,000 days, it's extremely difficult to catch up no matter how much you invest. And so we're pushing very hard for every single country to reduce and in fact, eliminate childhood stunting. So that's the first step. Then every step along the way, the quality of education, preschool, early childhood development, all those things turn out to be extremely important to prepare the leaders of the future. And the reason we're putting this index out is because we want the right people, the heads of state and ministers of finance, to pay attention to this. And it takes me to the question from Marie on Asia advocacy. So Marie, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation came to me and said that it was our fault that AIDS treatment in Nigeria was not going as well as it could because we classified Nigeria as a middle-income country. And so the request for us was to reclassify Nigeria as a low-income country so they could get access to free AIDS drugs. So I actually looked into this very carefully. And in fact, what I found led me to be even more committed to doing the Human Capital Index. Because it turns out that Nigeria only raises 5% of GDP in taxes. Now, our estimate is that countries need to raise at least 15% of GDP in order to provide basic services. And of course, the European countries raise a lot more. I think France is the highest at around 40% of GDP, right? So 5% of GDP, frankly, is not serious. It is not serious. They have to commit to raising more. Further, Nigeria spends 0.76% of GDP on healthcare. The United States spends 19%. Most OECD countries spend 10 to 12%. China spends 5% of GDP, 0.76%, most of that coming from IDA loans, which are the lowest interest rate loans. So I'm so glad that you're concerned about HIV treatment. I am too. You know, I have a long history there. But in this case, I have to say respectfully, I disagree, and that reclassifying Nigeria as a low-income country is not the answer. The answer is to put in front of the leaders of Nigeria, you only spend 0.76% of GDP on healthcare. We need to see your commitment, and I think you need to go to Nigeria and tell them to commit to their people. Tell them to commit to their people so that they actually raise more taxes and spend money on the people who need HIV treatment. I've been an HIV treatment activist all my life, but this is a reality. The reality is that many leaders are hiding behind organizations like yours who continually advocate for them. That's great. You're advocating for the people living with HIV. I know that. But we can no longer let leaders hide behind advocates and put none of their own money, don't focus on raising resources, and then have you say, well, what we need to do is reclassify them as low-income countries. And so I want you to know that again, 30 years I've been doing this, and the conclusion I've reached is that we have to keep advocating, keep doing the work that you're doing, but for us, it's not about changing the classification of the country. It's about putting in front of all the citizens' eyes, your country is only spending this much, and the needs are this much, and if you don't start spending and working right now, an entire generation of young people will not be able to learn, they won't be able to earn, they won't be able to participate in the economy of the future. So I hope that what we're doing is putting great tools in your hands to be able to advocate for donors, to be more generous, but then also to be able to advocate in countries to make sure that they do the right thing for their own people.
Thank you. I also want to take some questions from the tweet and read them. But first of all, I want to give you also what is given to me. This is a recommendation for the IMF and the World Bank from the C20. It's a 600 organization from 45 countries. For all of you that is represented in this, I'm giving the mandate to both Jim and Christine.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's a long list. I also wanted to comment about the there is a tweet that comes in. Trust. What is trust for the CSO, civil society, and IMF and the World Bank? I'm going to stand here. I'm with them, sorry. I'm with them, with the civil society. How can we make, representing civil society globally, make the civil society trust the World Bank and IMF? That's a question sent to me. And I'm going to take other two questions from this row and two questions from that row.
I am Visara Zemi with Balkan Green Foundation. My question is related to the energy sector and addressed to Dr. Kim. Dr. Kim, as you're aware, the Balkans region is heavily dependent on fossil fuels. Countries competing with each other, who is going to dominate the energy sector in the region by building more coal power plants. In one project, the World Bank has been personally engaged in Kosovo. But today, however, we heard from the Euro Director for Climate that this project is no longer on the table for the World Bank, and we would like just to get a confirmation from you as well. And two is, what can the World Bank do to help the Western Balkans region to transition from fossil fuels to renewables and efficiency? Because this is the future, and this is where the Western Balkans region should belong. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I'm Lisa Seidelmann from VEMOS, a Dutch-based NGO focusing on health. And my question is on health workforce and investing in health workforce beyond incentivizing the motivation of the existing workforce and beyond training. So while we know that the shortage of health workers is a major bottleneck globally, but particularly in low and low middle income countries, and we know that the workforce is needed to create good health outcomes and to deliver good services as well, and also for the access of to healthcare. So, and we also know that low and low middle income countries, so many of them have not a sufficient tax base to create the missing jobs. And I agree very much with scaling up domestic resource mobilization, but it probably will not be enough, or at least in the short to medium term, will not cover the funds needed for that. So my question would be, is there any possibility to maybe initiate a change of mind, rethinking about or regarding the loan conditionalities to allow countries actually to allocate parts of the funds they take out as loans to the salary of health workers in order to contribute to the creation of the jobs? Thank you.
Good question.
Two questions here.
Thank you so much. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen.
Please make it short if you're
All
reading
right.
a statement.
All right. We love have you all here in this meeting. My name is Buddy from Buddy Foundation. I represent every people in the world. I would like to ask your wisdom and knowledge for IMF, how to manage effectively disaster relief. As we know that Hong Kong has a tornado and North Carolina has hurricanes. Recently also Palu and Donggala have a disaster also. For World Bank, I'm asking about Burundi. Burundi is in South Africa. It's the second lowest poor country in the world in a GDP per capita. How to help them? It is Bitcoin and cryptocurrency can help their economy. We give direct access to online payment. As the World Economic Forum discussed about the fourth revolution industry of AI and cryptocurrency. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. We know that recently the IMF...
Your name, please?
My name is Ilham. I'm from Hivos. Recently, the IMF just launched the anti-corruption framework that we believe that it can revitalize the trust and also address the inequality in development. But the question to me, from me, is how effective, how far the IMF and the World Bank already pushed this framework into an effective control within the development finance. And the second question, we know that also it's easy to get money for countries to fund development from private funding and also other countries. So what is the strategy of the World Bank and IMF to address this? Because we know that those money not really within the standard of human rights, anti-corruption, as well as environmental. And those countries, members of the IMF and World Bank, of course responsible for the environment and the situations that affect by using the money from easy sources. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Please, I'm going to take 2 more questions, and then Jim and Kristen will answer. Any issues, hot issues, hot topics you wish to send it through tweets or through emails. I'm sure we'll make sure that every voice and every question counts. Sorry.
Thank you.
One from there, yeah.
My name is Catherine Kramer. I represent Christian Aid in the UK, and I'm here as part of the Big Shift campaign, which aims to get investment out of fossil fuels and into renewables and energy access for the poor. I've just come from Korea from the IPCC meeting, and as I'm sure you're aware, the report that they've just published has found that the impacts at 2 degrees of warming can be irreversible, both for social and for environmental systems. It may even cause tipping points within the climate system that may mean that 2 degrees doesn't mean 2 degrees, but rather more. The report also found that we probably need to reduce emissions of CO2 by 45% by 2030, which does imply getting out of fossil fuels rapidly. So my questions to you are, what are your institutional responses? And in terms of policies, do you have an intention to set emissions targets across all direct and indirect lending in line with 1.5 degrees? And if not, why not? And secondly, will you support countries to go beyond their Paris Agreement pledges? Because these, as we all know, add up to about 3 degrees of warming, and that truly is dangerous. Thank you.
Go ahead, Kristen. And I will ask both of you to make it short.
Okay. Do you want me to go? Or?
Go.
Okay. The first one, we could talk a lot about it, but you asked me to be short. Why should you trust me? Why should you trust the IMF? I think, the IMF and, any organization has to earn the trust, and once it's been earned, it has to deserve it. And it's not by being a populist, by adhering to one cause or the other that you are advocating and that you are passionate about. It's about listening, it's about telling the truth, it's about respecting our word, and we might disagree on certain matters. We might not be on the same page, but certainly we will be honest about our positions, and we will not, try to fiddle or to, receive favors from one side or the other, one country or the other. Keynes, when he started with a couple of other people, there were 40 men at the time who did it, said that, the IMF should be truthless, should be a ruthless teller of the truth. That's what we have to do, and that's what we have to do all the time. And certainly, ever since I've been the managing director of the institution, that's what we have tried to do. Some people didn't like it, and we should not be here to get favors, but we should be, delivering on the mission that we have and doing it honestly and with integrity. Second, the investment in health. I just want to make one point here. We are developing, and we will be discussing in the coming months, something that we call the social protection principles, and in particular in respect to the social protection floors that we want to require including in the programs that we have with countries in trouble. Because I think one of the learnings, and that's also about trust, recognize when you've made mistake and come forward and say, we made a mistake and we want to fix it. So clearly social protection floors are one way of addressing the issue of enough budget for health, enough budget for education, even though fiscal discipline has to be applied. Management of the financing of disasters. I would say first and foremost, do everything we can, and that touches on the last question, do everything we can in order to avoid the rapid recurrence of natural disasters, which are, we have reasons to believe, closely related to the climate change that is now more and more alive as a concept and more dangerous as we move forward without dealing with it. So I would say, first of all, deal with it, and in answer to your point, what we do as an institution is certainly encourage the removal of subsidies wherever they are, retarget those resources to those who need it in another form than encouraging the burning of fossil fuels. And, you know, I've repeated that many times and I will continue to do so, price carbon emission, tax carbon emission in order to give a value to those externalities so that people do not carry on, you know, with those emissions without even understanding and knowing that it is actually causing terrible damage to ourselves and to our planet. So from a tax point of view, from a fiscal point of view, this is the answer. Price it, tax it, do it now, and do it well. Second, clearly there are insurance packages that can be put together by pooling the risks and as a result lowering the cost of those insurance for those countries or those regions or those islands that are particularly vulnerable to natural disasters. This has been tried already in the Caribbean islands in particular. I know that the Indonesian authorities, and Sri Mulyani in particular, is looking at it for the Indonesian islands, and that's certainly an avenue that should be explored. Final one on the anti-corruption framework that we have now channeled through our board and which has been approved and of which the guiding principles are now available for staff. We are going to be very thorough, possibly intrusive, in identifying corruption wherever we see it, and we will take the appropriate measures whenever programs are in place, for instance, by simply stopping the program whenever we see that corruption has been effective in the public finance and where misrepresentation have been made about such financing.
Maybe. Jim? Should I answer?
Great. So on the Balkans, yes, we have made a very firm decision not to go forward with a coal power plant because we're required by our bylaws to go with the lowest cost option, and renewables have now come below the cost of coal. So without question, we're not going to do that. Secondly, on the health workforce, great question. And you know, the thing is that what we're hoping is that the new Human Capital Index will be so clearly tied to economic growth that anything that you invest in that can dramatically improve your health outcomes and therefore drive your potential economic growth will be looked at a little bit differently by ourselves, our own economists, by IMF, by even the ratings agencies. And so I think there's a tremendous potential because as low-skilled jobs go away in agriculture, in manufacturing, it's very possible that the sector which will absorb new low-skilled workers will be the care industry sectors. Those will always require human hands. And so it's quite possible that we could kill multiple birds with one stone. You could improve your health outcomes by having community health workers, community education workers, improve your education outcomes, community social workers. You'd have to balance how much you add to the wage bill by how much it's contributing to things like economic growth, local consumption. We've seen that that paying people directly for, certainly if they're doing activities, can have a beneficial impact on economic growth. Weigh all that with the fiscal responsibility. Now, I think we can find a path forward where we both find new jobs for low-skilled health workers and grow the economy and improve health and education outcomes for long-term growth. We're experimenting with that in several different places, and we think we think it's very promising. And finally, So, you know, the Christian aid question. So I think our goal was 28% of our portfolio with climate benefits, and we've reached 32%. We're also doing a CO2 accounting of our entire portfolio. And let me tell you, that was not easy. It's very difficult. And again, with great respect, let me tell you exactly why it's not easy. Because if some of our clients in Africa, for example, were right here, they would say to you, perhaps with less respect, so you come from the UK, spewing carbon into the air for many hundreds of years, and you come to us in Africa, who've put almost none of the carbon in the air, and you tell us that we can't have baseload electricity because you're outraged by climate change? We have had almost no responsibility for putting the carbon in the air, and yet you're telling us we can't develop and have baseload energy because we can't use a single drop of fossil fuel for our own energy needs. And I have to tell you, when I hear that from leaders, from people in industry, in places like Africa, it's compelling to me. Now, having said all that, I'm just as worried as you are about climate change. So what are we doing? We just announced that we're putting $1 billion on the table for battery storage, because that's really the issue. If we had battery storage, then and if we had battery storage, the current price is about $400 a kilowatt hour. If we could bring that down to $100 a kilowatt hour, then you could have solar with storage for around 5 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour, which would change the ballgame completely, because that becomes something that looks a lot like baseload, 20, 24 hour a day electricity. So I would just say, we're doing the accounting, we're putting our money where our mouth is. We have come so far in the last 6 years that I've been here in terms of our own contributions to climate change. But we feel that you have to listen to the social justice arguments of people from poor countries who've not put any of the carbon in the air and want to have baseload. In my position, it's very hard to deny that. And at the same time, have to put the incentives in the market so that the movement toward renewables accelerates. A company that we invested in called Nant Energy just announced that they can do battery storage for $100 a kilowatt hour. That is going to be the game changer if we can do that at scale. And at that point, there will really, we're talking a lot of stranded assets. Just about all the fossil fuels and coal will become stranded assets if we can do that. That's still up in the air, but I got my fingers crossed.
All right. Thank you. We have no more time now. I would like to have, I'm sorry, please send your questions to us, tweet. Every voice counts, even from around the world. We have to close down the session, but I'm going to ask Christine and Jim to give a closing remarks to the CSO. These CSOs has a lot of energy, very keen to be the partner. How can we trust the IMF? And, how can the IMF and the World Bank also enable the civil society to be a partner, a trusted partner? You want to give a closing remark?
Well, I would just say two things. One is we have to listen to each other. We have to respect each other. And I think that the fact that we have been holding those meetings now and that we are together and that all the teams, certainly from the IMF, are spending a lot of time and are constantly available for your questions.